Okay, episode 2, we are back. Welcome to whatever this is. It does not yet have a name. It may one day suggest a name. Let me know what you think. Shortcuts, hacks, cheat codes, and wormholes is my provisional name for this. Episode 1, the last episode, was an atrocity, so we're calling that episode 0. I think. We'll see. Shortcuts, hacks, cheat codes, and wormholes. What are they? Are they worth thinking about? Are they real? Why? Why would this be episode 1? What's the purpose? So, I think the first question is like this question of ontology. Are they real? Do cheat codes exist? I mean, obviously, cheat codes exist in the context of, for example, video games, or within some system, within maybe even within a bureaucracy, or within some closed system, there may be cheat codes. But there's this idea, at least that I have, that in the ultimate sense, in the physical sense, there's no cheat codes, right? A cheat code, maybe we could say, is equivalent basically to like magic or the supernatural. And let's set aside a little bit, we'll come back to it, this idea of spiritual and mystical, divine sort of things. But I think at least let's just stay in the main vein of secularism, at least in the beginning, of like, we imagine there really aren't at least physical cheat codes in the universe. Like the laws of physics are pretty solid, pretty sound. But I think the first distinction that I want to make is that, knowing with my very limited, knowledge of physics, um, one of the things that I've learned, one of the patterns I've noticed, is this idea that what we think of as the laws of physics, at least as lay people, the laws of physics we know, the scales of physics that we're privy to, right? We can't see microscopic things. We don't really observe planets and celestial bodies. Like we live at a certain scale, and the physics that we intuit, that we learn through our lives about the world, is not the immutable base physics, even if we suppose that there is some immutable base physics. Actually, what we're learning, our intuitions, are about a certain, God, I don't want to say echelon. That's such a pompous word to use, but a certain layer, a certain scale. I also don't like reusing it. I use the word scale already, so I got to keep things fresh and interesting. So, but we like when you start learning about physics, you realize the immutable underlying physics, its rules allow for what we in our lay conception of physics would consider to be cheat codes. Like nuclear, fusion or fission or whatever, for example. I forget when this was. I want to say the early 20th century, maybe. But you know, I think it was with evolving models of the atom. There was this idea of like, was it those first experiments where he shot, I think it was alpha particles at gold foil, and he conceived that there was some sort of very small nucleus that had the opposing charge. Um, but this idea that like normally, this negatively charged, I'll just say electron, passes right through this empty space. Occasionally, it hits this positively charged nucleus and is either deflected, or I think in rare cases even can bounce back. But I mean, you gotta get a Robin Hood shot to get it to bounce back. I think mostly it just deflects it. Um, but that there's this idea that like you could actually hit it with that Robin Hood style shot with so much energy that it actually would what was I going to say? It actually overcomes the deflecting. Oh, I guess I was going to say deflect. It overcomes the deflecting force and lodges itself in. Now, this is where my physics is pretty bad. But as I understand it, it's at the is it the strong force? I forget, but basically, like, it's repulsive at certain distances. So I guess the electron and the proton are electromagnetically have an opposing charge, but the strong force actually attracts them. But the strong force is only effective at super, super small distances. So until they get close enough, the electromagnetic force repels them. But then, if you can send enough energy to overcome that energetic barrier of the electromagnetic force, and it can sort of nestle in close enough to be attracted by the strong force, then I guess that would be fusion. Well, if it's an electron, I don't know physics, but I like to pretend. Um, so there's this idea that, like, we're not, you know, the, well, maybe there are some pretty awesome things in nature, but on a day-to-day basis, for most of us in our lives, we're not accelerating. We don't have those kind of concentrated energy levels where we're accelerating particles so fast that they can overcome these energies. So for us, the way the world works is pretty uniform, and then there are these sort of cheat codes where you know something about the underlying model that we're not privy to allows for something that seems impossible or contradictory or you know magical or whatever. So I think it's important to state at a base level that I think we can all agree with is whether or not there exists a base reality in which there's no cheating allowed. We as lay functional human beings in the world, by default, we must live in a world which permits a ton of cheat codes. And I don't know if I want to get too sidetracked into this, but I think it's interesting. I think it's worth talking about is that in human history, well, maybe more specifically the history of human civilization, maybe even a little bit of pre-civilization, um, access to cheat codes, access to now this isn't necessarily the quote unquote knowledge that we have today, where we understand something in a scientific or reductive sense, or even part of something, but this is like sort of a technological innovation, the ability to reproduce something. So, like, early people, even just being able to control fire. I mean, at some point in someone's life, they're old enough that they've seen fire, most likely, just naturally occurring. I think it can occur naturally, but mostly I think it's not light. Obviously, that's natural. But I mean, like, I don't think sunlight spontaneously catches things on fire very often. But most people will have seen lightning. They likely have seen fire, but this ability to understand its properties so as to maintain it and keep the fire alive, or just the technology of obsidian. Like, you notice this particular rock is very sharp, and so it can be very useful. Or you learn that you can. I remember as a kid, like, you can pull a blade of grass taut between your fingers and blow air over it, and it'll make a noise like a reed. Um, I like the musical like a reed vibrating of it with it. So it's like there are certain, in some sense, the history of human technology and innovation and art, everything, culture, is an accumulation of non-obvious knowledge about the world. In addition to obvious knowledge, but I think it's the non-obvious stuff that is more useful. Because if anybody can do it at any time, then there's no value in controlling it or harnessing it. So I think that's a lot of institutions. Like medicine is cheat codes and hacks of like how to fix the body. Martial arts or warfare might be cheat codes or hacks of how to destroy the body. Or obviously not necessarily the body, but this idea that you know, um, I don't know that this is the best language, but like in some level you could frame any, like the legal system is a sort of I have to be very careful on how I say this. is a sort of rarefied concentration or accumulation of constructs of control and authority and social harmony. Um, I don't want to say it's a hack; it's a cheat code. Because, well, I think maybe this is an important thing to get out of the way: is that a cheat code exists only because there's some sort of um, intentional, intelligent, some sort of system which the code accesses, right? There are shortcuts, and we might get to wormholes at some point. There are other things which are more naturalistic, but a hack or a cheat code, these are really, I think, built into a system. So, like we were talking about physics, which is like there is, in some sense, physics is a sort of a system with pieces and rules and well defined um, relationships. Pause, think, breathe. Oh, legal. So I think the distinction it should be important to make is that the legal system, the medical system, the martial system, the idea of a cheat code or a hack is only a meaningful idea in relation to a system. So then we have to ask the question, like, what is a system? What constitutes a system? And so then some of the things that I was saying, like that medicine is a sort of a cheat code. Well, medicine as a institution, or um, yeah, maybe we could say institution. Medicine, maybe it's not so helpful to think of medicine itself as a cheat code, but medicine is a system, is a systematizing force within which, because of the systematization of the, let's say, the human body, cheat codes can exist within medicine. Well, if we understand the relationship between X and Y, and we want more Y, we can just, extract and, artificially create a bunch of X, and we'll give you a surplus of X. And based on our knowledge, that should give you a lot more of the Y that you're looking for. Why do we always use the variable Y? So poetic. Why? Why? What's the Y that you're looking for? So I think that it's important to delineate or distinguish between the system and the cheat code, because systematization itself can seem like a sort of cheat code, but it's a different kind of cheat code than the cheat code. Everything I'm saying is totally crystal clear. If it's confusing or doesn't make sense, that's on you, okay? What am I saying? Systematization is like a comprehensive, well, encoding. You're translating between some naturalistic thing into a system, so you're encoding. So coding itself, I mean, we could say it's a kind of cheating, but I don't think that's useful. I think it'd be more useful to say that coding has some sort of value which allows for the innovation of cheating. Cheating can't cheat, quote unquote cheating, quote unquote hacking, really exist most meaningfully in the context of the encoding of a system. Whereas shortcuts don't require that same coded coding system delineation, um, categorization that I think hacking and cheating do. I should probably let's return. Let's focus. Let's not go too far in this direction. That was an interesting idea. Let's leave it right there, and maybe we can come back to it. Um, Cheat codes as compatible with reality through physics. Um, I think we touched on an important idea that there's always going to be different levels of understanding, and exist at a human level of understanding, especially when it comes to physics and the natural world. And so within any given level of understanding, the other levels, or at least the deeper or more fundamental levels, generally will tend to, although I'm tempted to say will always allow for, a sort of apparent cheat coding at the higher level. So I think that's a really important thing to understand. So an attraction to shortcuts, hacks, cheat codes, to instant gratification of instant progress, I think is actually, it's sometimes culturally we, maybe depending on the culture, but I don't know, but I have the sense that we sort of look down, we frown upon cheating or hacking or taking shortcuts. Um, but I think it's very attractive to a lot of people, and I think that there's potentially, we could say, like, there's not necessarily anything untoward about it, and potentially it's a sort of a noble attraction. That really, when we want to understand cheat codes, when we want to, hack something and get something for free, so to speak, where really it's a desire to connect with and understand the deeper layers of reality, or the deeper layers of meaning in a particular area. We're saying, um, is it Elon Musk or something? This idea of, like, if we could magically wave a wand and rearrange all the particles in something and just transmute it. So all that we required for something was just the raw materials, and all the energy and process and work, we just waved a wand. And what would be possible if that was the case? We still can't just create something out of nothing. We don't get to violate. Well, I mean, kind of do. We don't get to necessarily. We don't get to violate, let's say, the conservation of matter, maybe, or even energy. But we do. We're for some reason allowed to violate the conservation of process, or the conservation of prior dependency. What's the word? Continuity of what? Anyways, focus, truly. Um, so you're sort of setting a limit case of what's possible. And so I think a lot of times when we're looking for shortcuts or hacks or cheat codes, we're saying, like, what's the theoretical limit case? Reminds me of Tim Ferriss's, I think, what does Jordan Peterson call it? He calls it the Pareto principle. The idea that, I think it's the idea is in a system that, like, 80% of the output is accounted for by 20% of the input. And then in this book, I forget what it's called, one of Tim Ferriss's book, he talks about, like, a recursive Pareto principle, that of the 20% that is responsible for the 80%, only 20% of that is really responsible for 80% of the 20%. So, excuse me 1 second, I got a cough. If I talk too long, you probably can't hear it, but I can actually hear. It doesn't really bother me, except I can hear my voice. I can hear a little bit of phlegm. So every once in a while, I might turn off the mic, give you a little pop, wake you up, and that means I'm clearing my throat. So essentially, let's give an example. Okay, so you're working out at the gym because you want to be able to lift X amount of weight, and you're working and it takes you 6 months, and then you lift it. Okay, so that's the dream. So you say, well, it took me 6 months. Well, okay, but really, of that 6 months, how much was really you doing it? And you could say, well, it may seem like it was a very small portion. I only went to the gym, an hour a day or something. So that'd be 1/24th of the time. Then you would think, well, no, it's more than that, because there's also sort of rest time. But if you did a hyper optimized schedule where you rested only the exact amount of time necessary, and then you worked immediately, and then like, if you min maxed, you'd say, well, I only about 20%. Obviously it's just rough, but about 20% of the time was actually making progress for this. Well, about 80% of the time is just doing other things. And then you can say, well, of that 20%, well, maybe only 20% of that was actually spent, lifting the weight. 80% of that was resting and recovering. And then you can say, well, actually, of the time I spent lifting the weight, only 20% of that was were my muscles actually in contraction. The rest of the time they were, not resting, but waiting for the moment and exactly how to fire. And then you could keep going at many different levels and scales and dimensions of life. Well, if we cross section the actual muscle fibers, we would find that, you know, most of the time, even when the muscle tissue is in contraction, each individual, fiber or muscle fiber is only actually in contraction, 20% of the time on average. And then, potentially you could go to deeper scales. But the idea is that um, you can iterate this concentration of things. And this is one of the things that lends towards the idea of a shortcut, a hack, a cheat code, is that a lot of what manifests as process is really pauses and rests. Um, there's a funny, is it Sadhguru or something? I forget, but there's some. No, I think it's one of the Western guys, but maybe it's Alan Watts. He talks about like if the purpose. It's such a silly thing, but anyways, it's like if the purpose of music was just playing the notes, then people would just rapidly play the music as fast as they could, just playing all the notes, or you'd play them all at once or something. It's just one big cacophonous note, and the idea is that there's this relationship between the stimulus and also the space and timing between the stimuli, um, which I think a lot of that is not unrelated to sort of the neuroarchitecture of like our brain is wired. It works on these neural impulses and signals, and like neurons have a structure and limitations of like they're not on off. They like work in impulses. They send pulses around. So like in order to have a continuous state, you actually are the continuous state is sort of a is either a higher state or it's sort of illusory, because actually what's happening is that there's a cycling of lower states, because they can't just a neuron can't just switch on and never switch off. They just pulse, right? So because of that limitation, I don't know the causality or the process dependency of it, but I suspect that it's one of the reasons why we appreciate certain kinds of things like music. Um, but also, like, I see the same thing in poetry or wordplay, um, rhyming, um, alliteration. It's like, especially in like really good wordplay and like really technically proficient, you know, rap or something, you get this like, because each word is being processed neurologically and in these impulse chains, you'll hear a word like, car, and your brain is processing the sound car into the word meaning of what a car is. Then they'll say something like bar. I drove my car to the bar. The distance was really far. And now your brain it's a meaningful sentence, I mean, at some level, however simplistic that example may have been. But then also, as part of the subsystem of converting the sound into the meaning, the R sound is being reused. So if you think about the neural circuitry, there's a variation in the first syllable, or the first phoneme, the first part of the sound, but then it's always hitting the R. So there's this sort of rhythm to, I actually sort of picture like a deconstructed sort of, what's it called? The exploded internal view of a brain. And there's like these neuron signal pathways, and there's like almost like a drummer character who's like hitting a certain rhythm, And so like the initial beat is different, but it's followed up by the same rhythmic pattern. And so actually, I think that's why we enjoy certain things. I think it's one of the reasons why we enjoy rap is that the the artist who's rhyming in that particular way is actually sort of playing a sort of a mathematical or a sort of a geometric pattern within your neurology because of how sounds are processed. So um, I think that's one of the reasons why we appreciate that is that if we had a different processing mechanism, if we had like continuous state processing, I don't know that rhyming would be as enjoyable. But part of what makes rhyming enjoyable is the patterns of neural activation, like rhythmic patterns of neural activation, because neurons can only fire rhythmically. So when we ask them to fire within well-defined rhythmic patterns, I think they sort of enjoy that. That's why they enjoy, you know, those sort of geometric patterns, and visually as well. Audio, tactile. Like I just think there's um, there's a relationship. I mean I don't know what that relationship is. It's kind of a two-way relationship. Did it evolve? Did it adapt? Did it? You know, those are questions beyond my pay grade, so to speak. But I think it's very interesting. What are we talking about? Credo principle, cheats, hacks. Yeah, so I think that's one of the temptations is like, well, if a thing has um, structures built into it, if it has space, and it's like I'm thinking of like a house, like you're in a room or something. Um, I live in a van. I've always lived in small. I've always liked small spaces, small apartments. Um, and I think there's something to be said. I mean, especially like a van or something, especially like a really small, Japanese apartment or something. It's like how small can we make this? I mean, if you look at how RVs are made, or like converted vans, it's like everything has to be maximally efficiently packed into the smallest space possible. And there's this idea of like, well, we didn't actually need all that. Most of that space was unnecessary. We fit everything we needed in this very small room. Uh, but one of the things that happens is, as you live there, you realize like, oh, if I have I get wet or something, it's raining, all my stuff is wet, and I need to like lay it out to dry. Well, now half my room is taken up with, so, or I have to move this thing before I can access this thing, or, there's a lot of like process dependencies that become, that are manifest in this more concentrated space, and you realize like, well, actually, part of having extra space is you have sort of like staging room. You have you know, space that can just be used for miscellaneous, storage, process, whatever. Um, you know, like there's this. I forget what it might just be called like mathematically, like the couch problem or something, which is the idea of like if you can rotate the couch freely in 3D space and skillfully maneuver it through a doorway or an opening, then you can fit a much larger couch than you might expect through it. By you could sort of imagine by putting it on its edge, or not even on its edge, but sort of like uh, diagonally, sort of maneuvering it around the frame. And so there's a question of like a limit. I think in the classic couch problem in mathematics, you're just putting a square through a corner. Is it? Anyways, um, but you can imagine that like the theoretical smallest opening that a couch or any object could fit through would be, a sort of a cross section, a two-dimensional flattening of the object um, along, potentially rotated axes. So that would be really, really freaking difficult to actually fit it through that hole, the smallest hole that it could fit in, right? Obviously. Um, so that extra space, while unnecessary, it gives freedom, right? It gives a buffer. So I think part of the attraction towards, min maxing, limit testing, um, is I don't need all these buffers. If you're very skillful, you only need it to miss you by a millimeter. You can you don't even need the millimeter. You can shave things really close. So I think there's something, however it may be felt about, however people may feel about it. I think there's something quite noble in that sort of optimization of like, what's the absolute closest I could get to the optimum efficiency. So I don't think there's anything, I think that's a big part of shortcuts, hacks, cheat codes. Is this idea that it's like somehow wrong or ignoble, or it's unethical or whatever. But I think that dimension exists and should be acknowledged. It's important, not just because that's how people feel about it, but I think there's some truth to that. You definitely have to be careful. Maybe that's what we can get into next. But I also think that there's a positive side to it. There's something really good about it. It's like you're being drawn towards curiosity and discovery and understanding and deeper levels of, I don't want to say reality, but deeper levels of something's, mechanics or inner workings. So I think there's something very good about that attraction. So I think that's part of the walk, the balancing act, the dance of choosing to, I don't want to say walk the path of the cheater, but I mean, it's something individualistic about it. It's something like, I'm going to access my faculties or access my potential or, you know, access my power. I don't know what I'm saying. But when you make the choice, like, hey, I could be doing more. I could be pushing this. I could be optimizing. When you make the decision to optimize and walk the path of optimization, I think it's important to understand, to see that fork in the road, which isn't a unary fork that is at the beginning of the journey, but this constant balancing between, do I mean, it's interesting because the word cheating itself has that connotation. So I'm like almost tempted to use it, but I don't use it because I've used it in a neutral way thus far. But like, do I want to um, optimize nobly? Um, do I want to allow myself to not consider ethics and morality while I'm exploring the space, even if I later reapply it? Do I want to give myself the freedom to explore the limits of the min max and where that takes me, even if applying judgments to it along the process would eliminate some of those possibilities? Or do I want to just decide straight up, no, this is all that matters. I'm not going to apply, you know, ethical, reflective principles. I'm just optimizing this. I don't care what it costs me, you know. So I think that's an important balancing act, because I think that was part of the teaser in episode 0 was the balancing act of having a cheat code, of that they're dangerous, that cheat codes are inherently sort of, they're not a beginner technique. They're advanced. They have real serious dangers. I talked about corrupting. Power corrupts. Cheat codes give you power, and in some sense, there's this idea of like unearned power, and therefore power that you may not be prepared or experienced enough to handle yet. And I think that's very real and needs to be acknowledged. So, where are we? Well, hmm, it's what do I want to say about this balancing act? There was something I wanted to talk about the danger. So why don't we start with some examples? What are some cheat codes? So we talked a little bit about physics, right? Um, modern technologies are all cheat codes, right? But there's like the cheat code of the fundamental technology that makes it possible, and modern technological innovations like a smartphone or something is the accumulation of many many individual technological sort of cheat codes, and then iterative improvement. And I think there's a whole lot of iterative improvement yet to go, even without a more technological innovation, which we're also exploding with. So um, but I also think that there's the cheat code of, well, what does the device allow you to do? I mean, the device itself is a don't use the word consequences. What is an accumulation is a is the crowning jewel of many technological cheat codes. But setting all those um, what is it mechanistic cheat codes aside, functionally, what does the smartphone do for you? It's also a cheat code. One of my favorite things is I have an idea and then I just go, hey computer, what is this thing that I remember but don't remember the specifics of, and then just waiting 1 second and then having it say, according to this thing, you're talking about this and this is what you wanted to know. And I'm just like, oh my god, can you imagine a world where you'd have to go to a library, do like an hour of research to answer like a basic question about some obscure thing? um, so I mean, you know technology, modern technology, you know GPS, what a cheat code. But I mean, there's more fundamental cheat codes. I mean, just money, right? Um, Social privilege, economic privilege. Um, I think I talked about last time, like intellectual privilege, emotional privilege, cognitive privilege. Like, for example, being smart, that's a cheat code, right? But also being really dumb and contented, that's a cheat code, right? They're cheating at different things. The mind isn't just trying to do one thing, it has many different jobs. And so a person, a personality, and you're like, why is this person so dumb? Well, being dumb is a kind of a cheat code. It allows you to, I mean, this is a dramatic oversimplification, but one of the things that being dumb can allow you to do is to feel however you want about something without, being beholden to its actual core principles. You can just be wrong. It's way easier to be wrong when you're dumb. And if what you are wanting, if the thing you're optimizing for is, you know, feeling good or being right, like if you want to be right about things, being wrong is the easiest way. Okay, that sentence maybe needs a little bit of clarification. If what you're optimizing for is the feeling of being right about things, then to actually, in actual fact, be wrong about them is one of the easiest ways to feel as though you are right about them. Crystal clear logic, get out. Um, on the other hand, being smart can be a cheat code for solving difficult problems. For that's actually a really good metaphor of, like, I was just thinking of like solving riddles. Like these old stories, like you get to the bridge or the Sphinx, and you have to like solve a riddle before they'll let you pass. Like being clever is like it's a good way of getting through a riddle. It's not necessarily the most useful thing in the world, but it helps you pull a little. I love old plays because a lot of good, old plays have this like character in them who just like charms, social engineers, just sort of talks his way into. I love a good old play where someone's like, this is this way, and then the, I don't want to say charlatan, but the Willy Wonka, the wizard, goes, well, if this is this way, then that would be this, and then the person's like, oh my god, you've got me. um, so like so quaint, so So romantic. Focus, Julian. Where are we? What are we doing? What are we talking about? Talking about types of cheating. Different. Oh, examples. Money, wealth, privilege, social, whatever. Um, oh, maybe before we move on, I was just gonna say like, so there's like, you know, this idea that it's a double-edged sword. Like, let's talk about depression. Isn't it like 60% now or something? Something insane. It's like nearly 2/3 of all people have some kind of clinical or preclinical depression. So it's like not a small thing, but it is depression's a double-edged sword, right? I mean, I feel like everybody knows this, but like, let's just right. It's now, could we think about this as a cheat code? But it's like having being a person who just feels good all the time. If you're a person who is depressed or doesn't feel good all the time or is trying to feel good or see, you think, wow, man, that person, they somehow just have this cheat code. They just feel good. They feel certain. They're not anxious. They're not depressed. Maybe it's just their neurochemistry. Maybe it's their personality. Maybe it's their upbringing. Maybe it's their relationships. Maybe it's luck. Maybe they believe in God, or maybe they believe in maybe they whatever. They have something that just lets them feel really good. You think, man, they got some cheat code. I want that cheat code. And hell, maybe it's psychotropic drug. Maybe it's their medication. Maybe it's SSRIs. But for some reason, they have some, it feels to you, some cheat code that they don't struggle with feeling good in the way that you do. I think. But then I think, what's the cheat code? What's the benefit of the depression or of the other individual in that situation? And I think, well, the person with the supposed cheat code who feels good about things, they're going to relate to their life and the world in a different way. And I think one of the tendencies, one of the risks, I'm not saying this is necessarily the case, I'm just saying, for me, it seems one of the risks, one of the tendencies, I don't want to say is complacency, but is things are going well. So they're not in on opposition or contravention of uh, the status quo. Whereas the superpower of depression or anxiety or mental anguish or whatever is that you exist in contradiction to the status quo. You you have a motivation, a desire, a pull for change, for transformation, for action, for you're pushed, you're pulled, you're motivated to do something. So I think you know a cheat code. If there was an absolute cheat code in a system, it's only a matter of time before it's solved for, and then that just becomes the status quo. Everybody does it because why wouldn't you? It's just a cheat. It's better, right? We see this all the time in systems and in video games or whatever. It's like somebody figures something out. Nobody does it the other way ever again because why would you? You'll never see something like it almost be hard to learn it that way because you'll never be able to see anybody. So the moment you see anybody else do this ever, you'll immediately realize there's a better, more innovative method technique. So then a real cheat code in the sense that we think of it that other people don't know about or are not using seems, again, maybe not in the strictest sense of necessarily, you know but generally speaking, the reason that it's not used is because it's situational. It's relative to what you're trying to optimize for. Like there's no system in which only one thing is being optimized for. Then it's not a system. Then it's just like a tunnel. It's just a barrel. A system has multiple dimensions, meaning there's different things you can optimize for. Meaning each cheat code is relative to a thing you're trying to optimize for. So if what you're trying to optimize for is happiness and fulfillment and satisfaction, then sure, just believe in something silly. Just believe everything's going to be okay. Just believe in God and love, whatever. But if what you're trying to optimize for is transformational action, then maybe what you want is to be depressed and anguished and angry and upset and sick. And, you know, let's not. I don't want to get whatever, but like I want to say suicidal, but like you know, you want to be so sort of let's say artistic. Okay, you want to be an artist, right? Artists are all suicidal. Um, you want to be a little bit. What's the angst? Like edgy, whatever. Let's just. I don't know what I'm saying, and I shouldn't be poking around in this neck of the woods. But you know, if what you want is to leave a mark on history, being fulfilled and satisfied and contented in your life, I think is actually a sort of a hindrance, right? Um, I don't want to get too much into like optimizing for leaving a mark on history because that's how you end up being like a serial killer or something. But there's we have to, in some conceptual level, be able to think about these things, even if they're sort of a little taboo. So I think that's an important point. Is that you know there's no absolute cheat code. I was talking at the end in my teaser of episode 0. I talked about 4 years old getting a Game Boy, playing Pokemon's, um, and many years later encountering cheat codes. I think what I said was talking about how things that seem difficult and unobtainable and meaningful and worthwhile now were just it was just a number. I could set it. I was God in this game. I could get whatever I wanted, so it wasn't really meaningful. Um, and I think that's part of optimizing for something. Part of any sort of cheat code or hack is you also affect the value of what you're working for. The other thing is I would let's say pirate games. So what used to be getting any new game was so exciting and would just keep me interested, even if it wasn't a good game, even if it wasn't something I ended up liking. It'd take me several days to sort of work through it and exhaust it before I decided I didn't really like it. So just even some you know D tier game was so exciting. But then once I could download any game I wanted, it was like, okay. And then even when there was a game I wanted to play, instead of starting from the beginning, you know, one of the things is that there was this tool that would let you speed up. So like just the conversations you'd have with other characters in the game would go at a certain pace, and I could just like double the speed. And so it just was like, instead of there being this fixed pace, I was constantly pushing and rushing through it to get to the end because the time was not as meaningful anymore. So it completely warped the way I interfaced with the game. And then I had to start, before I played a game, I would have never played a game for the first time. But when you go over the game, it would say, do you want to play this or do you want to play this with cheats? And I had set it up so that I had all the cheats for all the games already loaded, even games I didn't know about or had never played before. So I would say like, oh, let's play it with cheats, and I just look through like what are the cheats for, and then like I'd never played this game before, so I didn't know how the game worked. I didn't know the mechanics of the game, so it'd be like, do you want to activate you know tunnel mode that lets you not follow this rule of the game? And I'm like, I don't even know what that rule of the game is, but like, sure, let's do that. So sometimes I would play a game and it's like I was playing a completely different game than the one that was designed, because the one that was designed had all these dependencies in it, and in mine I can just walk through walls and do whatever I want. So it's like the meaning of the game falls apart. So there's this balancing act now of like, you know, do I want maybe I want to activate double speed dialogue, or this the thing that lets me skip unskippable dialogues. Maybe that's something that I want. But maybe I don't want invincibility. You know, maybe I want to. Maybe I want to make it so that I don't run out of ammo. Because maybe that's an element of the game that, well, it's an important part of the game. I don't really want to deal with. I just want to have the fun of infinite ammo. But I'm not gonna activate the invincibility, because then there's no danger. There's no risk at all. I'm just messing around. So like there's this trade-off of like, now that I have architectural control, now that I'm a god, and I can do anything and get what I want. I mean, I could just go straight to the end screen. Now I have to decide, like, what version of this experience do I want? What cheat codes do I want to load up this time? Um, and I mean, as like a martial artist, it's kind of like, this is all fake. It's all artificial. We're just wrestling with our friends or whatever. So it's like I'm choosing not to load certain things. I'm choosing to, you know, not handicap myself, but there's some element of restraint. But there's always this idea of like, well, if I needed to, I could just use all my tools. I could load all of them, and I could really, you know, in theory, unleash. Um, but that's another thing too, especially if we're talking about being a cheat coder, a cheater. Yeah, living your life as a cheater. You know, being system aware, being a systems engineer, being a life hacker, being a whatever you want to call it, walking the path of optimization. Um, Among the balancing act and the choices, well, one of the things is just what 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 effect does any given cheat code have? And so now, if I'm being the architect of my own environment and my own experience and my own process, what do I want? Because I don't just want to defeat the process entirely. I don't want to just listen to every note of a song at once. But maybe I want to modify it and do it in a little bit of a different way. So there's a lot more responsibility, I think, that comes with the power of a cheat code. We've got less than 10 minutes if we want to keep this under an hour. There's absolutely no reason it has to be under an hour, but I feel like I'm enough as it is. What else did I want to talk about? So one of the things I wanted to talk about was the cheat codes related to learning, because I think these are really, really important, really, really valuable, and I think a lot of them just involve understanding your inner architecture, like what is involved in learning. Because if you're trying to shove information into a drawer, but you don't have a drawer, you have a river, then it's just not going to work. You're just sort of banging your head against the wall. You're wasting your time. And I also am a big believer that people, for whatever reason, whether they can or whether it's just the happenstance of their lives, people learn and process in very different ways. So what works for, or what worked for your teacher, may not work for you. So figuring out how does my brain work is so important, because when you understand that, it's just like this information that I'm trying to internalize. There's like a bucket, there's a hole, there's a character there waiting to take it and receive it. And I just do it once and then they know it. And it's like, oh, well, I just learned that. That was easy. Whereas if you're, throwing the information or trying to stuff it in and it's like not, it doesn't fit in with your inner architecture, you could do that 1,000 times, you'll never learn it. Or you learn it in spite of all your attempts to learn it. So I think that element of like learning cheat codes, like one that I absolutely hate, is like, I mean, I'm not a fan of mnemonic devices in general. Although, they make sense. The more meaningful connections you can have between things. But it's sort of like, it stretches maybe a little bit the meaning of the word meaningful. It stretches meta meaningfulness Just bear with me, okay? Um, because you're essentially taking non-meaningful or sub-meaningful things and you're using them to enrich the meaning, but in a way that's tangential to the meaning. You know, like the sound of an idea isn't meaningful, right? The emotion, the intent, right? The idea is what's meaningful. Yet somehow we use these other qualia to enrich it, and that enhances our memory. I've always been irksome of mnemonics, despite how effective they are. If you know anything about mind palaces, this association between sort of orthogonal sensory data in order to again enrich something so that you can remember it, I have a very interesting relationship to it because I'm much more inclined for a pure sort of conceptual understanding of something. But there's certainly something to be said for the somatics of integrated sensory perception being really powerful in terms of. I mean, we're talking more about memory than learning. We need to have a whole discussion. Maybe we can talk about learning. It can be a whole episode. I mean, if an episode is only an hour, I mean, I'm barely even touching on things. We're barely even discussing the subject. So, how much time do I have? Just 5 minutes. Okay. I mean, maybe we gotta go over an hour. I mean, at some point we gotta start going over an hour if we're gonna talk about anything. If we're gonna get to anything. So learning cheat codes, Gnostic cheat codes in terms of knowledge. I touched a little bit on this last time, but like questions as opposed to answers. Um, just like questions are Gnostic cheat codes in a way that like answers are, you know, Gnostic building block. They're just so limited. An answer is so narrow and limited in what it does, but a question is like, you know, it's like a blueprint versus the building materials. The question is like the blueprint. It's like the concept. It's like the vision. The question is like the vision. The answers are like the bricks. It's like, geez, you need a lot of bricks and a lot of mortar and a lot of people. You need a lot of answers to realize a question. Um, Jesus, there's so many. Still gotta talk about Aikido. That should be a whole thing. Aikido, the martial art I train, is kind of a cheat code martial art. It's all about. I think it's all about cheating. Um, you know, one of the things that it is like cheating in terms of like reframing what the problem is. Part of especially if you don't know what Aikido is, part of what Aikido is it says, well, if you think of the problem as me versus you, then this is sort of a lose-lose game. But if you change that, if you employ the cheat code, the hack of, in some games you can turn friendly fire on and off, the ability to hurt your teammates. So in a lot of games you can't hurt your teammates. A lot of games, especially online games, they have to sort of disable that because people will harass and troll other players by killing their own teammates. Like if your teammate doesn't do what you like, you just kill them. So most games, like online public games, have it so that you can't damage your own teammates. You can only damage the opponent. Um, so yes, and then some games you can turn friendly fire on and off, especially if you're like the leader, the creator of a certain thing. Um, so I think Aikido is sort of like the cheat code of almost like turning friendly fire off. It's like imagine there's a game where you can only damage your enemies but not your teammates. So this guy's like trying to destroy you, and you defeat him by friending him, and now you're invincible to his attacks because you're on his team. I mean, that's kind of what Aikido is. More later for another time. Oh my God, cheating and ultimate meaning and purpose in life. You know, that's the thing. Once you start optimizing, once you put your hand onto the universe and you say, let me decide what I'm going to get out of this, you make yourself further from a certain kind of naturalistic discovery of the universe because you're optimizing it. So what you discover is just going to be what you optimize for. So there's this huge fundamental paradox of like, if I'm just being and sort of bumping around, I'm in the flow. But the moment that I start optimizing and sort of placing stones in the course of the river, like, yeah, I'm crafting the flow, but I'm also outside of it somehow. I've I've become the architect instead of the inhabitant. Um, God. Well, let's see. How much time do we have? We have -4 seconds. All right. Well, God, cheating. God is a cheat code. God is for sure a cheat code that we will discuss another time. I mean, just let's just. Oh, I didn't even wind down and sign off. We have to wind down and sign off. And a teaser for next. Maybe God. Maybe God is the teaser. Maybe we talk about the ultimate cheat code, the cheat code amongst cheat codes. God as a useful cheat code. That is maybe that could be the title. Maybe that's next episode. God as a useful cheat code. I could dig it. I could dig it. Um, and maybe I need to flesh that out, make that a little more compelling. Because I think that there's good and bad, which is that it could attract and repel both religious and non-religious people. Because I'm was raised in a very secular, non-religious household, but came to a spiritual awakening, as an adult. So I'm very interested and compelled by the usefulness of certain spiritual, you could say, well, it's not even spiritually restricted, but certain kinds of cheat codes. And there is a kind of a category of cheat codes that we could call like, divinity or something. Um, and I think that's, what we could talk about divinity and God and all those things, but then I'm sort of more focused on like the linguistic invoking of God, talking about God, talking about divinity as it exists in human language and human communication, as opposed to how it could exist personally for an individual, how it could exist in an objective sense in the world. But in terms of like linguistically, the cheat code of God or supreme or ultimate or divine, or so I guess that's what maybe that's yeah, that's what we'll do next time. So come on back. Hope you are still alive and not have not deceased and passed away from boredom. Join me next time. Thanks. All right. Cheers.